Hello, hello, hello. Hi there, Scruff and Brooke. It's so good to see the two of you in the chat. This is so odd for me to be like streaming to like a private, unlisted YouTube link as opposed to like public on Twitch, but I wanted my patrons to feel special. In case you're watching this in VOD format later, hello, thank you for tuning in. This is a part of Professor Chong's Tabletop Workshop, which is a special patron-only live stream that I offer on my Patreon at byconniechang, BYCONNIECHANG. In this lecture, I will be talking about the dreaded session prep, how I approach prepping my sessions as a professional GM for Transplanar RPG and for Magpie Games' curated play program. My pronouns are they, he, and she. And you can follow along with the captions at the bottom here if that's easier for you to process. So, with that out of the way, a couple of announcements. As of the recording of this, Transplanar RPG's Patreon is open. If you don't know what Transplanar RPG is, Scruff and Brooke, I know both of you know what it is, so you can tune this part out. We are an all transgender, people of color led 100% homebrew Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition live streamed actual play campaign set in an original non-colonial anti-orientalist world. Arc 1 episode 1, which we recorded like a year ago at this point. Happy 1 year anniversary to us, is dropping finally in podcast format on your favorite podcast places: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, Podbean, pretty much anywhere and everywhere you can think of. We've got it. Except Pandora. Pandora rejected our podcast RSS feed. Pandora transphobic? Question mark? You heard it here first. We're figuring that out. But yeah, Transplanar RPG's Patreon is open, and our podcast will be dropping tomorrow, Monday, June 28th. So give that a listen. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, I guess is what they say, about our podcast. Leaving a review on Apple Podcasts really, really, really does help. We currently have 1 5-star review on our profile, but our first episode hasn't dropped yet. So now that the announcements are out of the way, I'm going to go right into this lecture for today. As a reminder, this is lecture number 8 of Professor Chong's Tabletop Workshop. The title and the theme of this lecture is Session Prep. It's been a long time since I've done Professor Chong, so I'm going to have to grease that groove. I'm going to have to oil that nut. Is that what people say? Moving on, ignoring that. This is a quick overview of what today's lecture is going to look like. I'm going to open with an introduction. What is session prep? Why is it important? How do I approach it? Etc. And then I'm going to move into how I prep my streamed games, specifically Transplanar RPG and other streamed one-shots I've run in the past. Most recently, the level 20 one-shot that I ran on Effin Funny's channel for Abria Iyengar, Gabe James Games, Critical Bard, and of course Christina Ariel, as well as how I prep home games, which for me as a GM who does both, pretty different. So whatever your context is as a GM, for whether you do streamed games, podcasted games, or your own home games, I hope that this advice can help you in whatever direction you're coming at playing and running tabletop games from. Then after talking about my different approaches for either type of prep, I'm going to be talking about how I prep narrative things, basically how I prep plot and story, right? And the 3 big questions I ask myself when thinking about plot and story, not just for a session, but for an arc or even the entire campaign. And then I'm going to move on to how I prep combat, specifically how I wing fights, but still try to make them feel cinematic and awesome and very descriptive. And finally, what I think is the most important part of prep, especially if you have players who love roleplay, who love NPCs, who love talking to each other, who love acting, is what I call emotional prep, right? How to make your players actually give a damn about what's happening. With the right kind of prep, I believe you can work toward that. Finally, we're going to end with some audience questions. There were 2 that were pre-submitted, which I'm very excited to delve into. I have not read them beforehand, so you will be getting my raw, uncut responses to your pre-submitted questions, as well as live impromptu questions that anyone who's a patron of, I believe, The Apprentice tier and above can ask here. So if you're interested in getting your questions on the board, if, for any Professor Chong's Tabletop Workshop, do pledge to my Patreon if you're watching this on VOD. I'll provide a link in the description. It will be there. So with that out of the way, let's move right into introductions. So here is the context of my approach when I'm doing session prep, right? I believe that there's kind of like a sliding scale of how thorough your prep tends to be. On one end, we've got people who are super thorough, right? These are like the GMs with like pages. Let's talk specifically D&D 5th edition, right? With pages and pages of notes about NPCs, about each NPC has like an ideal, bond, flaw, and traits, right? Like, NPCs have stat blocks, monsters have stat blocks. There's like maybe you even prep maps for like your encounters. You've got like all the names of every single building in your city or town figured out. This kind of GM is what I call a unicorn because I don't actually know if they exist. Maybe I don't even think like Matt Mercer does that kind of intense prep, but also Matt Mercer has like an entire stream team behind him, production team, so he can focus solely on campaign stuff. That's like one like extreme end of the scale, right? The other extreme end of the scale are GMs who don't prep anything. These GMs just wing every single session. Everything is improv. You know, on the most extreme version of this, they don't even write notes, right, about what their players do. Maybe they scribble a few names down so they can stay consistent, right, in the internal logic of their campaign. But other than that, they just kind of wing it. And as Connie, I think there's a happy medium to be found. I am happiest when I'm sitting somewhere in the middle, when I've done a little bit of prep, right? Just enough to sort of like feel like I've got my bearings, but still have room and flexibility to improvise and to find the joy in improvising, because otherwise I might as well write an audio drama, right? Like if I'm going to script everything out, if I'm like the heroes are going to do this and then they're going to do that and then the big bad's going to do this and that, like that, I might as well just write a novel or like script out an audio drama and release that as a podcast, right? But there's a reason why I'm interested in actually playing a game instead of producing an audio drama, specifically for my stream games. So if you're interested, if this is resonating with you in any way, if you're like, well, I don't know if I have the time or energy or the interest to like prep so much all the time, but I also don't really want to wing it all the time because I do want like to foreshadow things, you know, and like have my encounters feel tight and paced well, then you have come to the right lecture, my friend. A little bit of a more note on the context that I'm coming at this from. I have a lot of experience running Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, as well as Masks, A New Generation, as well as other Powered by the Apocalypse games. If you don't know what those are, they have a core resolution mechanic of 2d6 on a sliding scale. 6- is a miss. 7 to 9 is a mixed success, and a 10+ is a full success. That's basically it. For like PBTA games, that's, I would say, the one mechanic that ties all PBTA games together, though the originators of PBTA might disagree with me. But basically what this means is my approach is cinematic combat, emotionally driven stories, right? Emphasis on roleplay and acting, as well as just really emotionally intense stories. In terms of plot, I like having a clear and direct plot. There might be some mystery, there might be a few puzzles here or there, but that's not really my main concern. I'm also less concerned with like tactical combat, so you won't find much advice here in terms of like prepping combat on a grid with miniatures and stuff like that. So yeah, a quick overview of streamed games versus home games when I'm prepping. When prepping streamed games, I definitely skew toward more prep. Even though I'm kind of in the middle, I would say I'm maybe like 60 or 70% prep, while 40 or 30% improv of session by session for my streamed games. Of course, there's variance within that. There's definitely more sessions where it's been more improv heavy and sessions where it's been more prep heavy. But as a general rule of thumb, it's 70-30, I would say, maybe, or 60-40. For my home games, I definitely skew more toward improv. I would say there's definitely like, and I'll talk about this more when I go in depth about home games, but I definitely prep a lot more right after session 0. I usually sit down and I do maybe like an hour, 2 hours of prep, and then pretty much everything else I wing. I just like look over the notes I've already made for myself, and then I kind of wing it session to session. I take notes after the sessions are over to like help refresh in my memory, like where do I want the players to go next, but a lot of it is improvised because I'm not thinking about an audience, right? I'm not thinking so hard about pacing. Like players get to just plan stuff, right? Either in character, out of character. They'll be like, oh, how do we approach this like dungeon? How do we approach this like boss encounter? And they could take like 20, 30, even 40 minutes just talking in character, out of character, just planning stuff, right? Or arguing with each other, like roleplay wise, which is totally fine in a home game. There's no audience. Like if they're having fun, go for it. But I would probably cut that short in a stream game. And like all my like players know in Transplanar, like we're trying to put on a good show. We're trying to put on a performance. So we're also thinking about what's most entertaining for an audience, right? And that also does factor into how I split up my prep versus improv time. But here's sort of like the bottom, and this might be counterintuitive based on what I've said so far, but here's sort of the bottom line about no matter if it's a stream game or a home game about what I do. I do just enough prep and then I stop. If you take nothing away from this lecture, take this away. Don't over prep, right? There's a difference between being prepared, which is what I think a lot of those, you know, the dungeon master that I brought up earlier in an example is like all those pages of notes about NPCs, etc. But being prepared is one thing. Prepping what's going to happen is another, right? Don't over prep it, right? You don't want to railroad your players. You also don't want to like, if your players go off and like balls deep in nowhere land, you don't want to be like, well, I came up with all this stuff they never interacted with and literally just waste your time, right? Because when you over prep, you run the risk of wasting your own time, which is a big deal because we're busy, right? And you want to be really efficient with how you GM and how you prep your notes. And you also don't want to burn out because that is a huge thing. Over prepping leads to GM burnout, right? Which leads to fewer games, which leads to more frustrated GMs and more frustrated players. So for the sake of yourself and your players, don't over prep because you will burn yourself out if you keep over prepping session after session. And also, it's honestly sometimes not the best thing to do for the health of your campaign. If you over prep, you might over invest in ideas that never play out in your campaign. And you might even grow to resent your players for not taking on hooks that you prepared, but that's never, they didn't ask for that, right? So I think a good GM doesn't over prep because that means you're listening to your players. You're allowing space in your mind to expand and open up to what your players want as opposed to what you think they want. So that's just the intro portion, right, of this lecture. And now I'm going to do a granular look into how I prep for specifically my streamed games. Before I do that, I'm going to quickly glance at the comments. Great. All right. No one's asked anything. No big drops. Hello, Laura. Thank you for dropping by. I really appreciate it. Totally fine if you have to head out soon. I appreciate you swinging by anyway. And now I am going to drop into how I prep stream games. So I would say about 30% of my prep, right, is preparing encounters and NPCs. I would say that the most legwork for myself as a GM happens at the start of each arc or story beat, right? And like after that, I just sort of follow through on what I've already set up in my prep via improv, right? With like minor notes, I'll like occasionally scribble down a note during a session, and after sessions, I'll usually like synthesize all the notes I've scribbled down to like make a plan of action for the next session, right? For the next 3 or 4. But honestly, for every 4 sessions, that's what, 8 hours total if you play for 2 hours on the really short end, right, for each streamed game. I probably have 1 to 2 hours of prep total. Like, and that's just, that includes me sitting down and thinking, right? Not even putting pen to paper, just like thinking and like ruminating about it, right? Though C might disagree because I bounce ideas off of them all the time. So like all the extra like time that's added in, like bouncing ideas off of people that are near me, that probably adds another hour. So probably like 3 hours for every 8 to 10 hours of gameplay for my streamed games. But that might not be so useful to you. What does prep actually look like for me during my streamed game? I'll use Arc 3 as the most recent example. Hope this isn't too spoiler heavy. I'm going to try to avoid like actual things that happened. But basically, during this arc of Transplanar RPG, our player characters have entered a freaky carnival, right? Like a freaky carnival in the middle of the woods. But this carnival is sort of like reflects my PC's innermost flaws and fears and despairs back at them in a tangible way, right? So a lot of my prep time was spent designing individual quote unquote dungeons, more honestly encounters, tailor-made for each PC. So I made Oka like fight like a mirror version of themselves because, you know, a flaw that C sent me, I asked each player to send me like 3 flaws of their characters, right? And I use these flaws to inform my prep. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean when I say smart prepping. You want to use your players. They're your greatest resource. Ask them leading questions. Let them help you guide your prep in a way that doesn't spoil them about what's coming up, right? They know that they're going to be exploring like really emotionally deep stuff, but they don't know what their specific encounters will look like. They just know that their flaws, right, will come up in some way. But each dungeon was really different for each PC. For Oka, it was fighting like a mirror, like image of themselves, right? Like their ideal self, what they could have become but didn't. Because one of the flaws C sent me for Oka is that they hate themselves. They honestly, deep down, they feel like they're a monster. So I put a version of themselves up there that they have to grapple with that was like, this is what you could have become if you didn't become a monster, right? And I had like images of like their family like taunting Oka, being like, or like reacting to Oka with like disgust and fear. And that was definitely enough to push our poor Aasimar Bloodhunter to the edge. For Manaya, Devin sent me that one of like Manaya's deepest flaws was like not processing grief. Right? Like not spending the time to actually process her emotions, just like moving from one trauma to the next without thinking about it, as well as like this idea that sometimes she feels like she knows best, not just for herself, but for other people as well. So that's how I came up with the design for the Angel's Choice, right? And for Dewey, like it was, you know, Max said that like Dewey's flaws were that he's too callous, like he trusts too easily, but he's also really secretive, right? He like, the players, the other characters had no idea that Dewey had like a family. It was like a divorced dad, like for the longest time, right? Like Dewey has all these secrets. So I wanted his challenge to be like, he's always running away from his problems, but now he has to choose between saving himself, which is a cowardly move, or saving his family, right? And for V was one of the funnest encounters for me to prep because Erica sent me V's flaws, which were, she doesn't trust. She's impulsive, right? And there is one more, but I was like, this is so easy for me because Erica is so good at giving me emotional knives that I get to stab her character with. So I was like, I'm just gonna throw V into like a speed dating scenario where she gets rejected over and over and over again. And like every time she's rejected, it's because of one of her flaws. Like, and I tried to grade the rejection so they stung more every time. So we start with this random NPC, right? Ekoff, that I just made up. So it doesn't really matter if Ekoff rejects V because we don't even really know or care about Ekoff. But then I had Ekoff turn into Sievert, right? It was like V's ex, Dragonborn X, that V has feuded with already in the past. So there's a little bit of like care there, but Sievert sucks. Everyone hates Sievert. So when Sievert rejects V, right, for not being enough, it hurts, but it's fine because Sievert sucks and we know he sucks. And then I had Sievert morph into Rev, whom V actually cares about, is an actual love interest of V's. So when Rev rejects V, that actually really stings, right? And then I had Rev morph into like V's mother, which is like the ultimate, right? Like everything goes back to that parental trauma, right? Like when your parents fuck you up, you know, you carry that with you for the rest of your life. There's kind of a tangent, but there's a saying that like even good parents, right? Like parents are like fingers on glass and your children are glass, right? Even really bad parents will smash the glass. And leave you shattered, right? Shatter your childhood and you carry that trauma into adulthood. Even good parents, no matter how good you are, leave fingerprints, right? So we're all marked, right? From birth, basically, from like what happened to us when we grew up. So like I wanted that to be a really clear emotional line for V. And then of course had V's mom morph into like V's dad, which is like the ultimate trauma for her, right? Never knowing her dad. So I had a lot of fun. This is the fun part for me, like designing these like these little like torture scenarios, like emotional torture beats for each of my players. And that design for each of those encounters took me probably an hour to just come up with and then actually write out, and design and like make the notes for myself for each of the 4 PCs. And what do my notes actually look like? You know what? I'm going to pull this up for y'all because I love you all and y'all are so important to me. So I'm going to give you a sneak peek as what my notes actually look like, the notes I've written for myself for each of those encounters, which might be useful to you. So let's grab Oka. So I have a section in my GM notes that just says Oka, and underneath Oka, this is the dungeon for Oka. I write down their flaws, right? I basically take the text of what C sent me and I like boiled it down into like really just like very quick beats. I wrote, they're highly avoidant and will go to basically all lengths to avoid confronting their own internalized self-hatred. That's sort of like, that's kind of what C sent me, but I fleshed it out a little, and I also bolded certain key words for myself. So when I'm actually running the session and I'm like, okay, what are Oka's flaws? How can I like throw a knife into their back? All right, I'll see avoidant and self-hatred, and then I'll immediately jump into an NPC saying, why do you hate yourself so much, Oka? What are you trying to avoid? You know, just using those keywords that I've already written down for myself, and the ones that I've bolded, so I can just scroll through my notes, grab them, and just go while I'm prepping. When I'm running the session, because when I'm running the session, I don't have time to pause and like read my notes, think, and then come up with a line. Especially if it's streamed, I have to just like grab something and go. Right. After I've written out their flaws, I have another subsection, which I've called Funhouse Mirror Maze, where I'll outline the beats of what I think should happen during this mirror encounter. All I write down is Mirror Oka fights Rio Oka, and I write a few notes for myself about what Mirror Oka should be like. All right, Mirror Oka is what real Oka could have been. A quick physical description, long hair, unscarred, right? And then an emotional description, a worthy successor capable of wielding Dream Hunter, boom, which is the Emperor's sword that Oka stole. Acquired, but it was stolen, right? And I wrote another note for myself. This emphasizes their self-hatred. This is who they could have been. So this helps guide my role-playing of Mirror Oka, right? Note that I didn't write any traits, ideals, bonds, flaws, or even a drive for Mirror Oka, because I didn't feel like I needed it. I just need to reflect Oka's hatred of themselves back to them through the role-playing of this character, and I could just sort of take that and go. But that is also due to the fact that I have some background in like performance and like acting training. If you don't come from that background, I highly recommend taking improv classes, or just like looking up like improv rules online, or like acting tips online. Or, you know, you could probably do a little bit more prep work for yourself if like you do struggle with like portraying NPCs on the fly. Writing down a drive for your NPCs, like what motivates them, as well as like two primary traits, like two main personality traits, right? And maybe like a special ability they might have. But that goes more into running combat, which I'll discuss later. And then I write down, you know, and then I have just like a list of like NPCs important to Oka. So like Oka's family, Oka's sisters, as well as Oka's like mother and mother-father. And I just copy and pasted that from another document where I had like all of the PCs, relevant backstory NPCs, like in one. I just copy and pasted it here, so I don't have to always tab between like two Google Doc like tabs when I'm running my sessions. I always like to have everything that I need for one session in like a single document, so I'm not always like searching in like multiple folders for like the information I do have. So I collate everything under Oka, and that's it. That's all I had. I had like Dream Hunter, the swords, like stats in case I needed it, but I didn't. But I'll sometimes just like throw in the stat blocks I've already created for magic items or spells I've made up, just so I can reference them very quickly. But my notes are less like I have to read this out. This is less like an adventure path and more like just resources that I can tab to quickly, right? With like headings in my Google Doc in case I need to reference it, right? So even though my notes for session 7 are 18 pages long, of those 18 pages, the actual text that I've actually just read out from it probably only encompass like a page at most, right? Which gets into the second part of what I want to discuss for my streamed games, which is the 70% of my prep. So if 30% of my prep is that, right, what I just discussed, preparing encounters and NPCs that go with those encounters, what's the rest? What's the huge rest of my prep? It's my intro blurbs for my streamed games. If you've watched Transplanar RPG, you know what I'm talking about. This is like the little like spiel after like our actual player introductions that I do, like the like Dr. Aluso settles down and looks over, you know, like almost like a little prologue to the session, right? A little like beginning description. I set the scene, right? And this usually takes 3 to 5 minutes. 10 minutes if it's like a really long one, and I try to reserve longer blurbs just for like arc pilots, midpoints, and finales. I try not, because I don't want to avoid burnout and because it's not necessary. I only really need like a longer written piece of work when it's like a really like plot important part of the campaign. So yes, 70% of my actual session to session prep is writing that blurb, sitting down, because that's usually, let me just like grab it right now and like see how many words it is. Word counter online, everyone's favorite tool, like 200 to 500 words, I think, for like a regular session, and like up to like 1,000 words, I would say, for like a arc pilot, midpoint, or finale, which translates to like anywhere between 2 to 10 minutes of like actual session, like stream time when I'm reading it out loud. And yeah, it takes time. It takes time to write it, and it takes time to edit it. And then it also takes time to read it out loud and then go back and edit it again, to rehearse it, right, before the stream. That's most of my prep, session to session. That's 70% of it. And I think it's important specifically for Transplanar because it helps set the mood, right? It helps remind players of what's happening. It helps ground my players in the world. Like, feedback consistently that I've gotten from Erica, Devin, C, and Max is they love these intro blurbs. Like, first of all, it like takes the pressure off them because they know what to expect, right? Humans, we're animals. We love knowing what's coming next, right? We're scared of the unknown, right? So they like knowing that I'm always going to start every session with a little spiel before they have to act, right? Before they're thrown into the spotlight. And that also gives them some time to settle in, adjust to their characters, acclimate, drink some water, etc., and get ready to perform. So because I do this for every session, writing the blurb definitely takes up the most time of my like session to session streamed game prep. So yeah, that's basically my approach to my stream games. Again, the prep that I do at the beginning, around the middle, and toward the end of each arc is definitely the most. The prep I do at the beginning of each arc is enough usually to feed the next 3 to 4 episodes, and then I have to do a little bit more prep because by that point the story has changed enough that I have to like prep for the next 3 to 4 sessions probably, and then I just go like session to session like that, like clump to clump, like 4 session to 4 session to 4 session to 4 session clump like that. It's also very this sort of structure is also very intentional. I come from a screenwriting background, and we debuted a new sort of campaign arc structure approach for arc 3, which is my players basically kind of know what's gonna happen in really broad strokes, right? The specifics, so it's still pretty spoiler free, but because of that they know like how they should prepare to act. But I'll get to that later after I discuss how I prep my home games, because that's gonna get into like narrative prep, which is a different section of this lecture. So let's talk about home games, but before we do, I'm going to take a quick sip of water and check the chat. Laura says, it never occurred to me that overprep might lead to burnout. I worry so much about losing my way if I don't super prep. I totally hear you, Laura. I think especially for games that feel high stakes to me, like the level 21 shot I recently did, or like if I'm doing a new system especially, or like doing something with brand new players I've never played with before, I definitely have a tendency to over prep. I think it's a defense mechanism because I'm like, if I prep enough, then it can't go wrong, right? Like I have a contingency plan for everything that could go wrong, and I won't like embarrass myself or like make my players feel like they're not having a good time. And I feel that like I'll do it. I'll over prep just because, but it's for me. I recognize that over prepping is for me and that the material I actually come up with probably will never actually come up in the session, but it makes me feel good, right? Because it makes me feel like it's like a security blanket for myself. But I do implore you, please don't do it like consistently, because it can definitely lead to burnout. And this is something that my partner has C has talked to me about like quite often, like, Connie, you need to like take care of yourself because you GM so much. So I have to be very smart with how I prep and how I like divide up my time, right? Someone else says, Brooke says, I've played a lot of games and I have more fun in the improv style. It's easier to find space for everyone into the action versus a more rigid world where you can get shut out of play. That's very true. I think there's definitely pros and cons to both styles, which is why I like to blend both of them. So moving on quickly to how I prep home games, which might be more relevant to y'all who don't stream or podcast, right? I would say, and Laura, this is definitely me showing my butt to you a little bit. This is going to be like, this is how I prep our masks campaigns, right? I would say 80% of my prep happens before session 1. Between session 0 and session 1. And for masks specifically through the Magpie Games curated play program, which I GM for, the first hour of your 1-shot or of your first session of a 2-shot, 3-shot, 4-shot, whatever campaign, the first hour of that first session is always dedicated to character creation. So what that means for the CPP is I really have no idea what's going to happen. I usually have a pitch, like a hook, right? I always have to like pitch a premise to the CPP, like, oh, this new villain is in town and she's fucking everything up. Yeah, the four of you have to stop her. Like, right? And I'll usually have like ideas for like what the villain's gonna do, or like something like, you're stuck in a Groundhog Day time loop. How do you stop it? And I usually have a few ideas here and there about what's causing the time loop and like ways you could stop it, right? Like ways the session could go. But honestly, 80% of that prep is during that first hour for the CPP, or right after I receive everyone's character sheets, which is why I always like to ask for people to send me their playbooks and their filled out character sheets with their backstory questions. This is about masks specifically. So I get time to sit down like an hour, 2 hours before I run the session and write out and just prep the session. Ironically enough, the shorter the session, the more I prep, right? I prep more for a one shot than I do for a 4-shot. And I think it's because a 1-shot has to be tighter than a 4-shot. You have more leeway in a 4-shot, right? If I don't hit a beat that I kind of wanted to get to by session 2, it's okay, right? I could probably leave that to like session 3 if it's like a 4-session campaign or a 5-session campaign, right? But if I don't hit a beat that I needed to hit at like hour 2 and there's 2 hours of playtime left, right? Because, you know, this is also like a paid session, right? Because I want to make sure I'm compensating myself for my own time, right? And my players are getting what they paid for, right? Like that becomes a little bit more, I find there's more pressure to be regimented in a 1-shot. Which is also why I prefer campaign style play more, because it's less stressful for me. So this is how I do the 80% of that prep before session 1. During session 0 or character creation, I write pretty extensive notes, I would say, on each player's character and the angle they have on that character, right? I also make a note. I list out every single NPC that my PCs have mentioned in their backstory, whether this is a parent or a mentor or a rival or a villain they fought in the past, or like the doctor that injected them with a super serum that transformed them into a teenage superhero, right? I write notes, I write down their names, right? I write down what they look like very quickly, and I write down like a single sentence about their drive, right? And a couple of sentences about how they fit into the plot, if they're relevant, right? So this, with their NPCs and with like the actual notes about each PC, this is how I come up with ideas about how to infuse their backstory into what I call the front story, or what they're actually playing with, right? During the event of the campaign. And I always try to come up with like an angle for each NPC, like what I like to call how to like exploit the NPCs for maximum like emotional impact. So like basically just using NPCs as tools to push the PCs around and make them care about what's happening, right? After that, the rest of the campaign, the actual playtime, is just following through on what I've set up, right? I'll usually request maybe a 5 to 10 minute break between that first hour and when we actually jump into playtime. I'll take that break to drink water, go to the bathroom, and then like write notes about what's gonna happen, right? I like the mad scramble to like write down like ideas for what's going on. And that usually almost always starts with a villain. Almost always for my home games, especially if it's like, if it's a campaign with an end, like we're gonna play a 4-session campaign of masks or something, right? I always start at the end. Like, what's the end game here, right? For example, Laura, you know this, recently GM'd a game where basically there's like a bad future. One of Laura's character played a playbook known as the Harbinger, which is a character in Masks that comes back from the future, that comes to our current timeline from the future with knowledge of like bad stuff that's going to happen in the future. And they're back in the present to try to stop that so their future will be better, right? First of all, time travel is always hard to run, even in a game like Masks, which is very fluid. But with a game like that, I was like, okay, pretty obvious what the bad end of this campaign could be, what the forces of evil in this campaign want, which is to make the bad future happen, right? So I already know, like, straight up, like, that is the goal for my PCs for this entire campaign, which is to prevent that bad future from happening. What prevents that from being stale is changing up the villains, right? They confronted what they thought was, like, the main villain, I think, around, like, session 3 or something of a 4-session campaign. And then they ended up, like, teaming up with that villain because an even bigger villain had emerged, right, by like session 4. So like keeping it fresh, switch up your villains, always have a contingency plan for if like your players get to like the action too soon. But honestly, your players probably wouldn't. In all the games of Masks I've run, I think that's happened like, I don't think it's ever happened actually. If you come up with like a table where players get to the meat of the action before they're supposed to, let me know, because I don't think that's ever happened to me. which isn't a bad thing. I love it when my PCs like talk and like role playing character, right? I really love that. I love when I can just sit back as the GM and like let my players go at it, right? Because that means I'm just sitting there like, ooh, y'all are just having fun without me, or like with me watching, which is great. What else for my home games? Yeah, during that 80% of like prep time before session 1, I write out what's happening in the story. I have an Excel sheet. I have my keeper, right, for my Masks games, where I write at the very front, it's like pinned to the top. It's like, this is what's going on. And there's usually a secret or a mystery or like something that my players have not yet uncovered that I just bold, right? I'll usually have the text of the premise that I sent into the CPP, like at the top, like, for example, Groundhog Day, right? Oh, what's going on? You keep waking up and playing the same day over and over and over again. And then I'll make a note what's actually happening. I'll bold that. This is what's actually happening. Elijah Intrepid, a villain, right? Has shattered an hourglass that controls the sands of time. And because of that, the day keeps looping over and over and over again, right? Elijah Intrepid will stop at nothing to get out of Halcyon City's like time signature, even if it means destroying the city. Boom. Like that's the thing my players have to uncover. I'll give them a little breadcrumbs leading them to Elijah Intrepid. I'll have them like bump into Elijah. I'm maybe even open with the battle against Elijah when he shatters the hourglass in the first place, you know, and I'll like drop in clues. Some of them can be really ham-fisted. It's fine. It's always better if your players know more than if they know less, because then they actually feel empowered to go forward and advance the plot. And then I just run it. I would say the other 20% of my prep, specifically for Masks, which is my frame of reference for home games, right? Would be after I run each session, I'll do a little bit of prep for the next one, right? I shut off my computer after I run each session. I like play Overwatch. Wait, that doesn't make any sense. I play Overwatch and then I shut off my computer, or I just go to sleep and I rest. This is really important. This is an important part of the GM prep cycle. After I run a session, I rest. I take 2 or 3 or even 4 days and I just don't think about the session like at all. I like go outside. I like make myself some food. I do the dishes. And then when it's the day before the session or the day of the session, I sit down, right? I open up my notes again and I think to myself, what happened last session? And then I'll write a few notes about how my players' actions have changed the plot or how they haven't, right? And I'll write down a few ideas, maybe 2 or 3. Anything more than 2 or 3 ideas. And then I honestly think that goes into over prep, because then you feel pressure to throw all of them in, and that could make the pacing really fast. Sometimes your players do want to slow down and have the time to go deep into like one of the new things you throw at them, right? So I write down 2 to 3 ideas for new twists or new threats, right? Or new encounters that might come up, right? That might like push the players toward advancing the plot. So an example I'll use is the most recent Masks game I ran, also for Laura, because Laura is a freaking rock star. Is basically there are these entities known as suits, right? Think like the Silence in Doctor Who, right? That are trying to take over Halcyon City and take over the world. Pretty straightforward, big bad stuff. So stuff like new things I'll throw are like there's a new drug that's like circulating around the home base of our hero's base of operations that is basically like breaking down young heroes' mental defenses so the Silence can come in and take over more easily. And then I'll be like, there's corruption, right? Throw in clues that the organization that the PCs are working for is deeply corrupted, whether this is through an NPC acting really, really suspiciously, right? Or or something else, right? Another idea is like threaten an NPC that like one of my PCs care about, right? A younger sibling of one of the PCs, right? Or like that's true. That was true for 3 different PCs. I threatened a younger sibling of 3 different PCs, 2 different siblings, right? That was actually a lot of fun. Or like threaten like a mentor that like one of the PCs looked up to, like a superhero, right? That was killed by the Silence, right? Stuff like that. But I try to limit those again to like 2 or 3 new things per session. Otherwise, my players might get overwhelmed and it might feel like feel a little railroady, right? Where I'm trying to like definitely like move the story forward, pushing them a little too much instead of letting them lead the story, right? It's definitely a delicate balance, a delicate dance that I'm always having to navigate and re-navigate every time I run a campaign or every time I run a session. Yeah. And the rest of the campaign where the one shot is just, again, following through on what I've set up. You wanna pay off your hooks. If I've set up a big time loopy, situation, my players are gonna expect an awesome battle finale with time fuckery. So I try to pay that off, right? If it's like with the suits, my players are expecting a big epic showdown against the suits, which I try to pay off, right? If it's like two rival families fighting against each other, they're expecting a big showdown against the heads of each rival family, or like some sort of big public engagement, right? And I always try to pay that off. I always try to make the finale or the end of each arc or campaign feel awesome and like big, and everything that I've set up, right? And even though this is for a home game, I still recommend to GMs out there that you structure your campaign into arcs, even if it's for a persistent campaign with no definite end, right? The number of sessions per arc can definitely be flexible, but I really recommend running your campaign like seasons of a TV show, right? Because I feel like that's the most narratively engaging thing to play, especially if your players are story and roleplay focused. It's also easier to prep that way, instead of just having no end to like a single like plot thread, right? Like not knowing where it goes. It can help you a lot as a GM to think, okay, this specific mystery that they're trying to untangle, right? This mystery of the Spider King or whatever. It's going to take me maybe 4 to 6 sessions, right? So you can plan like a finale at session 6. What is the grand end plan of the Spider King? And then you work backwards from there. And that's usually how I do my home games, and how that's a little different from my streamed games. I usually don't write like a blurb or a spiel, because that does take a lot out of me. So if I did that for my home games in addition to my streamed games, I think I would burn out pretty fast. But I always try to like center myself and try to open with like an improvised spiel about what's going on, and then immediately like more quickly draw in the players, ask them questions. What are you wearing? Why are you feeling this way? What do you do? Etc. So I know that was like a big rambling spiel, but I hope y'all got something out of that. I'm going to take a quick sip of water, babes, and then check on the chat real fast. Okay. Hi, Paul. Welcome in. I see that there's some questions and some comments in the chat that I will be so happy to address at the end of this lecture, but I've got some stuff to go through. I'm always like, Professor Chong says it's going to take that long. It's going to take an hour. It's going to be a 20-minute lecture. No, I always end up rambling for like an hour and a half. So let's move on to how I prep narrative. How I prep the story itself of each session or each campaign or each arc. There are 3 main questions I ask myself whenever I prep a session, a 1-shot, 2-shot, whatever. The first question is, what are the PCs trying to accomplish? The second question is, what obstacles stand in their way? And the third question is, what happens if they fail? And these 3 things, the first one is the goal, right? The thing, the premise, the hook. This is what separates a session where it feels like things are happening at the PCs versus the PCs are making things happen, right? And I want to make it clear, sometimes it's not bad for it to feel like things are just happening at the PCs, especially if your players are newer to role-playing or to tabletop games. They don't know that they have narrative agency, that they can just do things, right? But the first question I ask is basically what are the PC's goals? The second one is about obstacles, right? Like what are the things preventing them from just achieving those goals, right? And the third one's about consequences, right? And this is particularly helpful if you're planning more than just a 1-shot, because if they fail, then you can use those consequences to affect the prep of your second session after that. So just go question by question. We talk about goal. I tend to like to have a single clear goal that all players are aware of out of character, even if their characters might not be bought into the goal yet or even aware of it, right? And I try to have a single clear goal for each arc. So let's look at Transplanar, right? When we go arc by arc. The first arc, their goal, the very first pilot episode, their goal was to find Dalapathy Saeed. This is something we decided session 0. This is a single NPC that are 4-player characters who are strangers to each other, because that's what my players wanted. They didn't want to know each other at the start of the campaign. They each have their own reasons for trying to find Dalapati Saeed, and that brings them to Fireroot Farm in northern Talmud, right? And then it just sort of like spirals and unravels from there. The obstacles I came up with, right, for the pilot episode of Transplanar RPG, why can't they just find Dalapati? Why can't they just show up to this farmhouse? Dalapati's there. Hello, great eyes, all your questions, etc., right? There are several obstacles. The first one is that Dal is missing. He's not there. They show up to his home and his husband's like, yeah, he's missing. I think he's kidnapped. So great. That means our players have to band together and try to find Dal. So they follow clues. They investigate tracks, right? Tracks lead them to like a cool butte, right? There's a talking cat. There's like a wall, a sculpture of a laughing dragon. There's all sorts of things happen. Fun little things like that they can just throw in, right? The obstacles are where you can really shine and have fun, right? And finally, the third obstacle I came up with is that Dalapati Saeed is actually a liar and he's not the man they actually want to find, right? Which is the twist at the end, which helps me spiral my PCs toward a new goal that feels organic, right? Which is to find the actual Dalapati Saeed, who is a figure known as Dr. Aluso. So the four of them band together. They have a travel montage that takes like 2 sessions, right? And then they get to Dr. Aluso's. And then Dr. Aluso, before helping them, asks them to help them. So you can see how like these it's like goal, obstacle, goal, obstacle, goal, obstacle. As soon as your players accomplish a goal, you want to spiral them into a new one, right? There's always more layers to their quest. There's always more mysteries, right? Until there isn't. Which leads me toward the third question: what happens if they fail or succeed? Honestly, the consequences, right? I guess that would be a better question. What happens if they fail or succeed? I'm actually gonna make a note for myself. So they do end up succeeding. They do end up finding Dalapati. So what happens when they find Dalapati? Well, I like to inject what I call a twist. The twist is what I mentioned earlier. Dalapati isn't the person they're looking for, which spirals them to Dr. Aluso. So always have a plan for what could come next, right? And you could prep this, which is what I did for my stream game, or you could kind of wing it, right? You could kind of, ideas might come up while you're running a session. Write those ideas down and then do it. Better yet, this might be rarer, but you should definitely take note when this happens. Your players might unwittingly suggest an idea that's better than what you had, right? Like players like conspiring together. They're like, wait, what if the person we're looking for is actually the bad guy? And you're like, well, okay, what if that's actually what happens, right? So your players will be like, I came up with that, but I'm glad you picked up on that, right? So that makes your job a lot easier, and it makes your players feel clever, and it makes your PCs care more about the plot because it's something they came up with, right? So those are the 3 questions I ask myself when prepping the story, and I continue to ask myself those questions. I always try to have a clear goal and clear obstacles in mind for the players. That helps me run sessions a lot more fluidly. And now I want to talk very quickly about something I started doing for Transplanar RPG starting Arc 3 that I actually think is paying off really well in terms of narrative prep, which is basically giving my players an arc-wide overview. I'm not sure if I can recommend this for a home game, but it works real good for a streamed game. So, for example, Arc 3. I don't want to spoil you all, but my players basically know the broad strokes of what's gonna happen. Not the plot, but the emotional beats, right? Each of Transplanar RPG's arcs are split up into 16 episodes, give or take. It's okay if we go a little over, it's okay if we go a little under. Which means there are 4 acts. And as a screenwriter, that makes me feel very comfortable and that makes me feel safe having a 4-act structure to lean on. The first act, Act 1, is the call to adventure, is like the initial hook that draws them into the arc, right? And there's some flexibility here. That's the first 4 episodes. It's the intro into the problem. It's where I might introduce like a couple of new NPCs, but mostly have the players drive the action with what they want to do. And then the next 4 episodes, that's episodes 5 through 8, right, is Act 2, Part 1. And that's when things start going. That's when the promise of the premise is delivered upon. So the promise of Arc 3's premise is the carnival. Our players know about the carnival from like episode 1 of Arc 3, but they don't get to the carnival until episode 4 or 5, which was planned. My players knew this going in. They had time to break up and split up and do individual quests for the first 4 episodes, which was totally okay. This was something we decided on as a cast, as a group beforehand. And now we're at the midpoint. We're at episode 8, which is kind of a downer, right? My players kind of knew that I was going to throw something really tough at them. I was going to beat them down emotionally, that they were going to be broken down and vulnerable and stabbed through with knives by episode 8 of arc 3, which was the midpoint of that entire arc. And we all agreed we wanted it to be kind of a downer midpoint. And moving onward, not to spoil anything for y'all, but the next 4 episodes is going to be Act 2, Part 2, which is sort of a spiral in a new direction. There's new developments, right? Our players have to rally. That's all they know. These next 4 episodes, you have 4 episodes to rally and get your shit together. And what that looks like is still unknown, but my players just know that broad stroke going in, so they know, okay, I need to start to rally here, right? But I have four episodes to do it. And the final 4 episodes are Act 3 of Arc 3, right? This is episodes 16, 15, 14, 13. This is like the lead up to the grand finale, the big conflict, either like a boss battle or a huge confrontation to just wrap up the entire arc. This is the showstopper. This is the grand set piece. This is the big thing that your players and your audience members, if you're streaming this or podcasting this, are going to be gushing and talking about like for days and weeks on end after that, hopefully, fingers crossed, right? And I recommend, this is something I learned, my blunders from Arc 2 specifically, that we really need to leave like 2 whole episodes for the finale. Finale part 1, finale part 2, and then 1 whole episode to wrap everything up, the denouement, right? So that's episode 16 is going to be the denouement. That means episode 15 and 14, 2 whole episodes for the boss fight, right? Which leads only 1 episode to move us into our Act 3, which feels perfect, right? So that's what my players knew. They knew the basic emotional beats of Act 1, Act 2 Part 1, the midpoint, Act 2 Part 2, and Act 3, right? And that has helped Arc 3, in my opinion, feel really narratively satisfying so far, right? Everything feels like it's spiraling at like a good pace, in a good direction. And I'm very excited for what comes next because all of us are on the same page about the general narrative roadmap without it being too spoilery, without it feeling too railroady, because it's something we all signed up for. Something to consider if you're also thinking about streaming games in the future. For sure. So I'm going to take another quick break to drink some water before moving on to how I prep combat. Okay. And now moving into combat prep. I have a lot of love for combat because I love big set piece battles. I love it. I actually do really enjoy running violence in my tabletop games. So probably the first thing I do is look at the context of the combat, right? Because I almost never do random encounters. I used to when I was first running D&D 5th edition because I didn't know battles could be any other way. But now I try to make all of my combat matter in some way, right? Whether there's always some narrative stake, right? We think about the battle between Oka and Mirror Oka. There wasn't like a MacGuffin at stake. They weren't fighting over anything. You could argue that they were fighting over Dream Hunter, but that wasn't even it. That fight mattered because it was Oka literally fighting themselves, right? They were fighting an ideal version of themselves. And it was like a physical manifestation of their self-hatred, right? So that's why it mattered. It was emotionally impactful, and Oka was just having a real bad time, and all of those words are capitalized. So how I prep combat is I look at the main monster, right? I look at like what's my PC fighting, right? What are my PCs up against? And I prep that monster or that villain or that creature or whatever's drive, i.e. why they're doing what they're doing or like what they're trying to accomplish in this combat. For Mirror Oka, I mentioned earlier, I didn't actually give Mirror Oka a drive because I felt confident to run Mirror Oka without one. But if I had to give Mirror Oka a drive, it would be to elucidate Oka's failures as a person. That would probably be it. Which is like why, like, when they were having that like reparteeing, when they were bantering with each other in the fight, like everything I had Mirror Oka say, I try to hammer that drive home. Like, you're a failure. Like, you're a monster. Like, your family doesn't even want you. Like, stuff like that. Like, ouch, right? But the ouch is good, right? Which gives Oka a lot to work with in terms of an acting standpoint, but also in terms of like a character development standpoint. Like that, I'm really pushing Oka to despair here, right? Which is fine. Safety tools wise, like C was totally okay with this. And I try to make that really clear in my villain strife. And the next thing I do when preparing combat is to prep some cool stuff. There's some cool stuff they can do, right? Cool abilities, right? In the context of D&D 5th edition, I do not like prepping specific saves. Stuff like Fire Breath, DC 21 dex save, roll 15d6 on a fail, half damage, on a save. I don't really like doing that. Instead, I like writing evocative lines of what my creatures can and can't do, which is very Masks-esque, right? So for example, this creature can slam their fists onto the ground and create a massive shockwave, and I don't have anything written in terms of saves for that. I might, if I have the time, but I usually don't. And then, I can just sort of, improvise saves based on what they can do if it comes up, which also goes into not over-prepping, because some of the moves I write never come up, right? So this could be, a dex or strength save. I might, wing it on the spot, depending on which PCs I'm asking the save from. If it's from my big burly fighter, I'll ask for a dex save. If it's from my sad little artificer, I'll ask for a strength save. Whatever's gonna make their life more miserable. And I'll kind of throw in a DC in there that I think they could maybe hit, say 17, right? And I'll decide, even if they succeed, it's half damage, right? At full damage, I don't just make it just damage. If it's D&D 5th edition, I always also try to add a condition. And conditions in D&D aren't angry, afraid, etc. They're prone, stunned, paralyzed, etc. So a big shockwave, what could that be? That could be paralyzed, or that could be prone. You could be knocked prone if you fail your strength save, right? Or it could be pushed back. I'll make something up, right? And then after I make that stuff up, I'll make a note in my notebook about what the save DC is, and about what the skill it calls for is, and about any additional conditions it inflicts, just so I can stay consistent during the rest of that encounter. And honestly, for D&D 5th edition, even if a combat heavy session is coming up, I never use stat blocks. Ever, ever, ever. I do not prep a monster's strength, dex, con. I don't even prep its HP. I might decide an AC, or I might just see what they get and go, man, that's enough for it. That's not quite enough. Honestly, what I do prep, what I do spend my time doing instead, how I spend my time, your time is your most valuable resource here, is I calculate the average damage per round that my baddies should be outputting given my player's average HP and or their level, right? And then I give myself a band of damage. So for example, what this means is in the level 20 one-shot that I recently ran on F and Funny's channel, I calculated that the baddie that they were all ganging up against, there was a single monster they were ganging up against, so I gave it a ton of reactions, one reaction per turn, not just per round, and a bunch of legendary actions too. So the action economy was a little bit more balanced. And secondly, I calculated it based on their HP, based on their level, that the baddie should be dealing 24 to 36 damage per attack. Right? So every time it made a legendary action, every time it did a reaction, every time it did something on its turn, every single attack had 24 to 36 damage, right? And I just picked a number in that range, right? I'd pick a lower number if the PCs were doing kind of poorly, if they could use a win. And I picked a higher number if they were really kicking the monster's ass, right? And I just hit them with it. And I decide the type of damage later, depending on the flavor of how it's attacking, right? And I like to give myself freedom to improvise how this monster can do things, right? Matt Colville has a really great series about action-oriented monsters. I want to expand on that theory more and push it even further. So the example Matt Colville gives for D&D 5th edition prepping monsters in combat is give each of your monsters something a little bit extra it can do on its turn, or even a legendary action, even against a group of level 3 or 4 adventurers, right? So the example Matt Colville gives is the Unkeg, which if you don't know what kind of D&D monster that is, it's basically a big ground grasshopper that can spit acid, and it's got it's got pincer things, right? And Matt Kova was like, what if we gave the Ankeg a burrow move? It can burrow 30 feet, and not provoke opportunity attacks, which allows it to pop up anywhere on the battle map and like attack other creatures. And I think this is like a legendary action, so it can do this like once per round at the end of another player's turn. I would push that even further. I wouldn't even differentiate this between legendary actions, whatever. I would just be like, whenever it feels right, the Ankeg can just burrow, or it can spit acid, or if like a player like hits its armor, even if a player like hits its armor class, I might have the player make a con save as like a gasket of like acid shoots out, potentially blinding that player for like a minute, and they have to repeat the save at the top of each of their turns or something, right? This is a side note, still really going to session prep, but a thing about how I run D&D that I think more GMs should start doing, is even if your players miss the AC, have them deal damage anyway. But in exchange, the monster gets to take a reaction. And they are not limited to one reaction per round, because I think that's dumb. Especially if you're running only one monster against a party of 4 to 6 adventurers, right? And this has worked out very well in Transplanar. It feels awesome. Because even if my players miss, even if they get a 7, that's obviously not going to hit even like a horse, right? I'll let them roll damage anyway, and I'll have the horse kick him in the head, right? All right, you hit this horse, but it kicks you. So they feel like they did something, right? And the horse is reacting, which also feels more cinematic, which feels more realistic to how combat would actually go, instead of you just running up, hitting it, and then someone else runs up and hits it, someone else runs up and hits it, and then the horse finally moves, and then someone else runs up and hits it, and then like all of your gang up on this poor horse, right? I don't know why I picked horse, it just felt right. So these are general notes about how I prep combat. Specifically in D&D, masks. The reason why I love running masks is because running combat masks is so easy. You don't even really have to prep for it. I know monsters and villains and masks are supposed to have conditions. Listen, I know I'm supposed to track their conditions. But honestly, I think it's just about reading the pulse of like how tired your players are, and about how the pacing of the battle feels so far. So much of prepping combat is just giving your villains like a couple cool things they can do, and then being okay if they don't get to do those things all the time, especially if time runs out, right, in the session itself. So I'm now going to move on to emotional prep, which I think is the most important part of any sort of session prep, and also takes the least amount of time. And honestly, I think effort. But before I do that, I'm going to take another sip of water. And check the chat. Yes, Fiona, no stat blocks. That is a reveal. I'm definitely showing my GM notes here, but that's what you get when you're a patron. You get to know all these Connie secrets, Connie secrets of GM stuff. Okay. Moving in. So, okay, a quick thing about stat blocks, right? Because that made me think of something. The reason why I don't like stat blocks is because I don't like vanilla D&D. If you like how D&D combat feels without modified rules, by all means, please continue using stat blocks, because that's what works for you. But if you feel like either the action economy is unbalanced, like your party is just decimating everything you're throwing at them, right? Or you see your players twiddling their thumbs, yawning, checking their phone, right? Waiting for their turn because the other players are taking like forever, or you're running like a million, or you're running like 4 monsters, you have to roll for them every time. Like that's why I ditched the stat block, right? Because I feel like there's definitely some flaws in vanilla D&D for the tables I run, right? Which is we like fast cinematic combat. We like to be able to do cool, flashy things. We want monsters to feel lethal and fun and dynamic. We want the terrain to also change. Like, that's why I ditched the stat block, because honestly, vanilla D&D stat block doesn't really support that kind of play. But that is a completely different lecture, I think. Just like monkeying with monsters a little bit more, right? Ditching the stat block. I have like a million more things to say about that, but that's very specific to D&D 5th edition. Now I move on to more session prep stuff. So, emotional prep. What the hell does that... What do I mean by that? This is actually a new term that I have more recently come into after I've been GMing for a while. It's been a year, woot woot, since I've GM'd for Transplanar RPG. I was recently editing Arc 1, Episode 1, right, of our podcast, and I was marveling, honestly, not to toot my own horn, but like seriously, I'm so glad we recorded it, because I can see how far I've come as a GM. Like back then I was still hiding lore behind history checks, right? Like back then I was still like giving my monsters 17 AC and low HP and like not letting my players do something extra even on a miss, right? I feel like I've come a really far way. And one of the biggest ways I've come is through emotional prep. And what I mean by emotional prep is, so what do your players actually care about when they play, right? The players that tend to come to my tables, and there's different types of players, but I'm talking specifically about players that play tabletop roleplay games to have an emotionally engaging and fulfilling and fun and enjoyable experience. You don't have to be an actor, right? But these tend to be players who enjoy roleplay, right? Who care about their characters, who don't just like come up with like, all right, this is Bob. I guess he's a human fighter. I'm okay if he dies in this dungeon run. That's not the kind of player I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about the C's and the Maxes and the Devons and the Ericas, right? And the Lauras, right? Of the world. Players to whom characters are a way to either experience catharsis or just like play, right? Act and play and role play and like do fun shit and pull cool stunts that you literally can't in real life. And to those players who are character driven, who love roleplay and story, right? And the world and lore, right? Engaging with the campaign in such a rich way, they care about the emotional stakes, right? Which is also why I've ditched running random encounters. So what I mean by this is looking at the themes of my current arc and writing them down. So let's look at Transplanar as an example. Arc 2, Raven Queen arc, Court of Ravens. Themes there, the undeath was the primary phenomenon, right, that my players were trying to stop. The profane undeath, as well as Rev as a major NPC coming into her power as a paragon. Arc 2, what I would have done differently, because this is a pretty new concept that I'm playing with, that I think has really made Arc 3 fantastic. In my opinion, it's my favorite arc that I've run so far, as well as like, made the level 20 one-shot that I ran recently so successful. And something I always try to carry with me when prepping my Masks game for the CPP is the emotional core of the arc. What I would have done differently for Arc 2, I would have focused more on the emotional core of grief. Because death, the Raven Queen is the goddess of death and life, right? Two sides of the same coin. Death is natural. Death will happen to everyone. That's totally fine, right? But what's also natural is grief, grieving those we have lost, right? What I would have done differently, I would have hammered that home with my players. I would have designed more leading questions to ask them, more encounters that would have dredged up my PC's experiences with death, as opposed to just sort of having them go here and there and like look at stuff and like meet people and do the derby, etc. Which is why I'm particularly excited about Arc 3, because the theme for Arc 3 is escapism, right? It's ignoring your problems, putting a band-aid over it, right? And just wishing it goes away. Or rather, partying instead of actually dealing with problems, right? That if left unchecked will fester. I try to set this up starting with the Arc 2 interlude that bridges Arc 2 and Arc 3, with the encounter at Bacchanalia Beach, where we meet B. Zelda came in as a guest star playing Bamba, who's the regent of Nabal, who instead of actually doing anything about the apocalypse, the literal freaking apocalypse that's taken over Andake, is just partying. And even like the name, even what I named Bacchanalia Beach, Bacchanalia was an ancient Greek kind of event of drunken revelry, right? Having fun and partying instead of looking at the looming apocalypse, right? And now with the carnival is all about breaking you down, right? Throwing my PCs at their greatest flaws and breaking them down, throwing them into that hole of despair. So they all turn to the same conclusion, which is they let the carnival take them, which means they ignore the problems and they just stay in this fantasy land of pleasure. Right? So they don't have to sit with those hard emotions and actually process them. And that is the emotional core, right, of Arc 3. And I tried to make that as clear as possible, how I prep how I prepped this, and I have to owe a lot of this to my partner C, who is the dramaturg of Transplanar RPG, and for so many of my Masks campaigns, as well as the other one-shots on stream and elsewhere that I've done, my partner C is my greatest editor and dramaturg. What I like to do is I scribble down the main themes of whatever arc I'm doing, put them on a Post-it note, and I tape it to the top of my desktop, or I like pin it to the top of my Google Docs, right? And this also comes from like my screenwriting practice, right? Always know the theme of your story. Always know what you're trying to say with the story that you're telling, right? Because everyone has watched a superhero movie before, right? But what separates Iron Man's story from Thor's story is that they're grappling with different problems. They're both really powerful white dudes, right? With like magic abilities, or in the case of Iron Man, he's just rich. But the emotional core of their stories are so different, and that's what differentiates them, right? So after I discover what my theme is, or I really know what my theme is, whether that should have been grief for arc 2, it was definitely rage for arc 1, like anger, right? And for this arc 3 is escapism, right? I then find as many opportunities as I can to drill this theme home. So for example, in the level 20 one-shot that I ran recently, the big bad evil guy, the main villain that my 4 level 20 players were fighting, is basically the manifestation of grief, right? So the main theme there is grief. And the PCs are also kind of manifestations of grief as well. But I wrote down to myself, I need to hammer home the difference between this big bad evil villain, which I call the Stranger, and the PCs, which is that the PCs have each other, but the Stranger is alone, right? And I helped drive that point home by asking leading questions, right, in the second half of that one shot. I pre-prepared questions. I think what I prepared was, before the end of the world, you had hit rock bottom. Where are you when this happens? What was your rock bottom, right? And each of my players just took that prompt and they ran with it, and each of them painted 4 extremely different but like equally poignant scenes of grief and loss and aloneness, right? And I was able to sort of tie them together, right? But then like have each of them help each other out of their grief. And then I straight up told them the theme. The difference between you and this monster is that the 4 of you have each other. You have love, and you have each other's support and friendship. This thing's alone, right? Which also like cultivates almost a little bit of empathy for the villain they're fighting, because that's always more interesting to me, a villain that is kind of understandable even if what they're doing is unforgivable, right? With the carnival, the example I'd give for fighting as many opportunities as possible, bash them over the head with the theme. The carnival for Transplanar RPG, what I wrote for myself for the theme is bash the PCs over their heads with their flaws, make them hurt, and then when all is lost, offer hope. Right? And like, this is just like a quick little emotional note I've written for myself that's at the top of every GM note that I have, every GM prep doc that I have. That when I'm lost, I look at it. If I don't know what to do, I look at that and I do what that says. I bash them over the head with their flaws, make them hurt, and if they feel like all is lost, I offer hope. And right now we are at the all is lost moment, right? So what y'all can probably expect for a session is a little bit of hope. And I try to inject hope through like the cutaways to Dr. Aluso from last session. While our players were in the middle of this like horrifying carnival, we cut to Dr. Aluso, their NPC quest giver, on their way to rescue the PCs, presumably, right? Hope. They're bringing in past major NPCs from like from a different arc, Rev, right? Who's also there to help. So there's that glimmer of hope. Even if our PCs in character don't know that they're coming, my players out of character know, so they don't feel so down on themselves, right? I still do have to flesh out my theory around emotional prep and maybe come up with some more tangible guidelines for how to do that. But I honestly, I really do think I'm onto something here. And I highly encourage y'all to think about what is the emotional core of the stories you're exploring together as GM and PCs, and how can you hammer that theme into like every session that you do by just preparing a couple guiding questions, right? During while you're prepping. And not just hammering over the theme, but like giving players opportunities to explore the theme or reject the theme, right? Or like build upon the theme or offer foils to the theme, right? Yeah. And that's something you can just write interesting guiding questions and throw them at your players for. So for example, stuff like, if let's say one of your themes here is revenge. Let's say you're running a story where your 4 PCs are all on a quest to kill the person who wronged them. All 4 of them were wronged in a different way, but they band together to kill this one evil dude, right? You could like ask them, you could show them, hammer them over the head with this theme, show them an NPC that tried to do the exact same thing, but revenge took them, and now they became the very monster they tried to take down, right? Or show them an NPC who successfully pursued her revenge and feels at peace. Show them like the different endings to their story that they could encounter through the NPCs. You could show them like the consequences of their actions, whether they actually took steps to seek that revenge or if they took steps to seek forgiveness instead. Have both of those choices have consequences, right? And design some leading questions that can pop into any session with them. So for example, something like as you sit there, by your campfire, ruminating on the tracks, right, that will lead you to your hated enemy. Tell me, what memory is bubbling to the surface for you right now, right? What surprising memory is bubbling to the surface for you right now? And that's a really messy question, right? But a player could really take that and run with it, and you just sort of build off what they give you. I know that I'm running out of steam for my lecture part when I start doing these hand motions like Gordon Ramsay, right? So I'm going to take another sip of my water, babes, check the comments, and then I'm going to answer some of your questions. Okay. So, there are 2 questions that have been submitted beforehand from our lovely, lovely patrons. The first one is from S. And this is, I'm just going to read this out loud. I recently prepped for a session where I, the GM, knew I would be playing multiple NPCs who each had different pieces of information they could disclose about the current plot and related lore, based on what the PCs ask or choose. My notes ended up being a lot of bullet points for each NPC, some of them just info and some actual quotes I prepped to say beforehand, in case I need it. My issue is, once I prep like this, I have the tendency in session to info dump everything to my players in a bit of an NPC ramble. Maybe it's because I prep it this way, I feel like it must all be said, or I have a fear that if I don't disclose enough, my players will be lost or confused. How do you prep this kind of info in a way that lends itself to be player-led in-game? And I'm just going to drop the text of that in chat so the rest of you can see. Oh, it's a little too long. Okay, that is... You know what? I'll just answer it and then see if I have time to drop that in chat. So, seems like the crux of the question here is has to do with a little bit of overprep for me. Couple months ago, I ran a murder mystery, and the most important part of a murder mystery is, of course, clues. Actually, unraveling the mystery, and the mistake I made, I think, the mistake that I implore you to avoid, is tying specific pieces of information to specific NPCs. So if the PCs don't talk to that one NPC, they won't get that clue. Instead, how I sort of did it on the fly, because the PCs weren't talking to the NPCs that I'd prepped for them to talk to, right, is I just came up with a list of clues, right, just at the top, and they could be assigned to any NPC. And I just came up with a way for how that NPC would know. So for example, let's say one of the PCs spoke to a servant, right? And was trying to interrogate the servant about what's going on here. And one of the clues I have is that there was blood on the snow outside of the Lord of the house's bedroom, right? So I could have the servant be like, well, don't tell anyone else this, but I was tending to the flowers, behind the Lord's private quarters, his private garden, and I saw blood. I saw blood on the camellias, something like that. If it were a noble that they spoke to, it could be the wife of the Lord who goes, well, I was in my husband's quarters the other day looking out at the camellias when I saw blood on the petals. Well, of course, I had to fire the servant who let such a disgrace come across my manicured garden, but etc., right? So each NPC could still have access to the same information, but have different reasons for accessing it, right? So I would say instead of having like clues tied to specific characters, just have all the clues in one place, and then you can drag and drop the clues depending on like who the PCs are talking to. Let's see. In terms of info dumping lore, as a GM, I actually don't really have anything against a lore info dump. I said this before, I'll say it again. I think it's always better to give your players more information than it is to give them less, especially if you have that information prepped. But so it doesn't feel like it's like spiel after spiel from NPC. Maybe instead of like writing out like an entire paragraph of what they could say, just give yourself a few bullet points to like work in more naturally into conversation. And also, so it doesn't feel like a ramble, have your NPCs have strong opinions about the lore they're info dumping, right? Like a thief, info dumping about like a magical artifact could be like, yeah, there's some talk, among the Thieves Guild that the hand of Ukodor has been acquired, right, by the Black Cat Guild. But the Black Cat Guild, they're a bunch of scum. They're a bunch of scoundrels. They just acquired the hand by pure chance. My guild's gonna get it, just you mark my words, right? A thief could have that approach, whereas like an upstanding citizen from part of like the militia brigade could be like, yes, I've heard word that this hand of Ukudor has been making the rounds again in our town. I will do my best to find it and destroy it, as is my duty as a magic regulator, right? Have them have specific like approaches, opinions, perspectives on the lore they're info dumping. Let's see. A fear that if I don't disclose enough, my players will be lost or confused. Again, always better to disclose more than disclose less. And if you're ever, unsure, you can ask your players, does that feel clear? That's something I'll ask occasionally. I'll pause and be like, does that feel clear? Do we have a clear picture of what's going on here? And depending on how my players react, I'll modify accordingly. How do you prep this kind of info in a way that lends itself to be player-led in game? I've mentioned before, sometimes it is necessary to just sort of push your players, especially if they're not really interacting with the world around you. And I do think that some systems lend themselves to be more player-led than others. So this could also be a system issue. If you're playing D&D, I saw this discourse going on Twitter the other day about someone posted that some players are just naturally incurious, right? Just like naturally not as interested in engaging with the world around them, which means they might not like uncover lore. But then a rebuttal is that D&D just doesn't incentivize players trying to uncover lore. It assumes, right, that lore is just there, but it's static, right? It doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually change the world around you. So what could be interesting is if you dangle juicy bits in front of your players that they can't help but go to. So if you know you have an NPC who's got really interesting lore, if you know your players and make that NPC sexy, I guarantee you a player's gonna go up and talk to the NPC or have the NPC do something so outrageous or so interesting, right? The players can't help but be inquisitive, right? You could describe an important NPC as just like, yeah, you see a person sort of sitting, he's got a hood on in the back of the tavern. Your players would be like, great, I order beer, right? And just completely ignore it. Or you could have the NPC go, you could describe the NPC as, you see a man, or at least you think they're a man, hunched in the corner of the tavern with a hood drawn low over his eyes. Occasionally, he mutters to himself. And then you see his hand move toward his waist. No one else in this tavern seems to notice his hand moving toward his waist. You see the flash of a hilt of a dagger. What do? That's, I guarantee you, at least one of your players will do something about it, right? Kind of coax the action toward them, right? You could also like go the super reactive way and just have the hooded figure go up to their table and like, be like, hey, move, you're in my regular seat, or something like that. But asking your players, what do? Will usually prompt them to respond to stimulus you just set down. That's my long-winded answer to you, S. I hope that was helpful. Moving on to another pre-submitted question from Fiona. Where do you put fun future ideas so you can find them? Sometimes I have a brainstorm for a character or NPC moment that could be great, but definitely won't come up in the next session or two, and I don't want to lose it. This depends on how you keep track of notes. There are 2 ways I keep track of notes. One of them is through Google Docs. Actually, there are 3 ways, technically, I suppose. If I'm running Transplanar RPG, I have a Google Drive for all of my campaign folders. I have every single session I run has a different file for it. And I also have folders for notes about the world as well as notes about the player characters. So depending on the kind of note, I'll just slot it into the appropriate document. So if it's a note about an NPC, I'll put it in the NPC doc. If it's a note about a player, I'll put it in the player doc. But if it's something that I don't want to just put somewhere and forget, I will write it in my little handy dandy moleskin here. This is the notebook. This is the document that I use when I'm actually running sessions that I write notes down on. So if I come up with a really cool idea, I'll scribble it down and then I'll circle it. And I'll do my best to remember at the end of a session to look at what I've circled and then just go back into my notes and write it down. And because I have a new document for every new session that I run, if the note is particularly relevant, I'll put it in big bold letters at the top of my next session's document. I also have a section in each of my documents that I just call campaign notes. That's always pinned at the bottom of my document, and I'll just throw it in there, right? And this is where I have all of the relevant impromptu notes that I've come up with, so I can always refer to it. Hope that was useful. Another question from Fiona that's off topic, which is totally fine. Doesn't have to be related to session prep. How do you handle failures on PC to PC comfort and support moves? Aw, it feels strange to tell a player, don't take this well, if in character everyone's having a good moment. That is a downfall of that move, I think. I think how I've done it in the past is I'll allow it to just succeed. I'll be if they roll a 4 or a 6, I'll be you know what? Just take the success, right? I just treat it as a success because it feels like it should succeed. That's one way to approach it. Another way that I've done it before, and this is in a situation where it does feel like maybe it's kind of up in the air. It would have been nice if it succeeded and the players could see it succeeding, but the players also won't be so ultra disappointed if it didn't succeed, right? I will ask the person that the move was targeted toward, you sense this PC reaching out to you, but something about it just doesn't quite strike a chord. What is it? And I'll have the person on the receiving end decide why and how it doesn't strike a chord, even though the other PC is trying really hard. But if it feels like it should just work and the players clearly want it to work, then I'll just rule it as an automatic success because it's pointless to have it fail, right? So moving on to questions from the live chat. Now is the time for y'all to drop any questions you might have in chat, either about session prep, anything I've spoken about, clarifying questions, follow-up questions, or anything about GMing. It doesn't have to be related to session prep. I will field any other questions as well. I'm just going to scroll back through chat and see what people have asked or posted. Brooke says, I've played a lot of games. Oh, wait, we already said that. Yep. Laura said, I think I'm good with PCs going in wild directions, so I wasn't worried about railroading PCs because I have a plan, but burnout is real for me. Totally, 100%. Definitely don't over-prep to protect yourself. Hope stream goes well. We'll watch the VOD. Well, I hope you're watching this VOD, Laura. Love you so much. Paul asks, are your games for Magpie closer to the streamed or home end of the spectrum? I would say they're closer to the home end of the spectrum. I will write a spiel. I will usually write a spiel for the first session, right? But I'll more often than not improvise a spiel at the beginning of subsequent sessions if it's a campaign. Yes, like I said, specifically for Magpie games, so much of my prep happens before the session even begins, and running the session itself is pretty easy. It's the prep for it that takes the most time, I would say, and the most labor and energy for myself. So how I do it, again, is I look at all of the players' backstory answers. and I pull names and I pull events from those backstory questions, and I find ways to weave them into the campaign itself. And I think that really does come through in how I run my Masks games. I try to have the things that players give me in their backstory like actually really matter in the campaign, and I very rarely just inject random ideas like on my own end into it, unless there's like something that's clearly missing, or I'll bridge a gap, or I'll form unexpected connections between PC's backstories, right? But the raw material I draw from is almost always exclusively based on the backstories I'm working with already. And of course the premise that I pitch to Magpie, right? So it's the two of those blending together. Let's see. Fiona notes that blocks us reveal. Love this. Yeah. Another thing from Brooke, it's always nice to feel like you did something as a player. My least fave encounters are ones where I get taken out before I even get a turn. Yeah, that sucks so much. I hate it when that happens. I hate it so much, which is another reason why I've been ditching the stat block. So all my players feel like they can actually do something in combat, and they don't have to wait for like a million years to do the thing, only to swing and miss. That is the worst thing ever. If you're in a D&D campaign with 6 players and you're on initiative like 7 because there's like 3 creatures that you're fighting, you roll your attack roll and you miss. That's the worst thing ever. I hate that, which is why I always try to like work around that by homebrewing D&D combat. That looks like it's all, folks. That's all I have planned for my lecture. That's all of the questions that were pre-submitted, and those are all the questions that I picked up through the chat. So thank you all so much for tuning in to our inaugural Professor Chang's Tabletop Workshop, lecture number 8, session prep stream. This will be available as a VOD immediately to apprentices, cavaliers, paladins, and champions, and then probably like a couple days or a week later, I'll make it open to tippers as well as the public. So if you're watching this as a VOD, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your attention and your time. And with that, I'm going to sign off with the announcement that Transplanar RPG's Patreon is open. So if you want to support the campaign that I GM for, that so many of my examples are based around, you want to see what's up with that, you can go to patreon.com/transplanarrpg or twitch.tv/transplanarrpg, or you guessed it, twitter.com/transplanarrpg. As a reminder, our podcast is now out by the time this becomes a VOD, right? Not by the time of this recording, but by the time this becomes a VOD, our podcast is now out. Arc 1, Episode 1, and all subsequent episodes will release on a bi-weekly Tuesday basis on all podcast platforms. So please download our episodes, listen to our episodes, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That will help us with visibility and reach so much. And thank you again to everyone who tuned in. I'm so grateful to my patrons for making this possible, for supporting me. Like, I think there's like 29 of you now, which is insane. I never would have imagined that so many people would believe in me and my work. And my heart is just so full. So thank you. And with that, I hope the rest of you have a wonderful day and evening. I will see some of you who are Transplanar patrons or Twitch subs in tonight at 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time in the Transplanar RPG server for our 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time podcast launch party, where we'll play Jackbox games and just hang out and and maybe even have a dance party. We'll just have a good time. And with that, have a good night. Thank you for tuning in, and bye-bye. Doom de doom 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 de doom 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 doom